Hello, Penn State fans. It's Wednesday, January 29th, the final BWI Live, the Wednesday version of January. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. I don't know where the first month of 2025 has gone, T. Frank, but it has flown by. Penn State finished its 2024 season earlier this month. The Nittany Lions then hit the road recruiting during the contact period that they missed the start of for good reason. They were still playing, obviously. Penn State hires Jim Knowles, loses Tom Allen. So a very busy month, and that's just on the football side of things. A lot going on in the wrestling, hockey, and basketball worlds as well. But Penn State getting ready to close out the final recruiting contact period of the year 2025 in the month of January. Obviously, Jim Knowles still the big talk of Nittany Nation as well. T. Frank, looking back over the month that was, it's hard to think back to December 29th, 30 days ago, and think we'd find ourselves in a position where the final show of January would, at least in part, feature two topics, one being the hiring of Jim Knowles from the defending NCAA champs. Impossible to predict. But also, number two, the other thing we're going to get into today is some roster strengths and weaknesses. And I guess maybe because the season went as long as it did, it didn't completely surprise me. Penn State comes out of the first transfer portal window in pretty good shape, both in the additions and subtractions. We're going to dive into that today. But were you looking back over it now that we've had some time to reflect with the transfer portal window closed for the better part of, I guess, 2 weeks now, this first one of 2025, surprised how mostly unimpacted Penn State was throughout that 5-day window?
Yeah, I don't know, because it just feels still unsettled. Like at any moment, somebody could throw up a lawsuit or get a waiver. And so that just generally the feeling of, is this done? Are we sure this is it? Does kind of linger, because the other part of this is that, Ohio State and Notre Dame, their players are 2 weeks behind everybody else in terms of they're entering the portal, they're having to make decisions. So it doesn't feel like anything's been settled. And I know with Jim Knowles joining Penn State, there's 1,000 questions about, okay, who else is coming over to the program from Ohio State and or from elsewhere. And it just, I think they did a good job, as you mentioned, with retention. But it does feel like on the addition side, everyone was expecting more. And so I get that feeling. I also kind of have that feeling, but at the same time, you look at what they did and they addressed all of their needs in one way or another at critical positions. Defensive tackle, they got a player from Michigan, a guy that they like. They got a defensive end, and they got 2 wide receivers. Now, I think the element of over-the-topness doesn't exist, but they did what they normally do, which is they target guys at specific positions that they feel like can come in and play. And then for the most part, a lot of these guys are developmental players where they're maybe can contribute this year, but for the most part are going to be strong contributors down the line, like Owen Wafel or TJ Shanahan. I think those are some super valuable moves. You look at what they've done with like a Johnny Dixon or a Chop Robinson or an AJ Harris. Some of those guys contributed right away, but some of them, took a couple years before they were the full-time starter, and Penn State really reaped the benefits there. So it's just that last piece of going all out for positions of need that I feel like fans are maybe rightly feel like they didn't do, but also maybe it's overemphasized. We don't know at this point, because we don't know what these guys are going to be on the roster right now.
We do know at least they're here for spring practice and, of course, winter workouts. And some of the hopes Penn State had with previous transfer portal additions were tied to guys coming in after all those ended, and you had guys come in the summer and then have to jump right into things during preseason camp. The good news for Penn State is, at least for the time being, all of its transfers showed up on campus for winter workouts, for spring practice. Winter workouts, of course, right around the corner as we sit on the doorstep of February. I'm going to try and get through the rest of this show without choking on any more water. We'll see if that happens. But at this point, we can say that we'll get into this transfer portal stuff a little bit more here in just a little bit on this edition of the BWI Live Show. But we can say Jim Knowles has had his first team meeting as the new Penn State defensive coordinator. He arrived on campus on Monday morning, shortly after the Penn State Board of Trustees committee of whatever they call themselves now approved his contract. He showed up at State College Airport not long after that, and then became the guy greeting the team, which is something he has not done for a few years because he last took a new job when he left Oklahoma State to go to Ohio State back in 2021. And so his first meeting, he played up his Philadelphia roots, T. Frank.
Yeah.
He told them that, when he was a kid growing up, he wanted to play at Penn State, wasn't good enough, but through a lot of hard work and really good players and so on and so forth, now ends up at Penn State, calling it the place he wants to be. Fascinating, and it'll be really interesting. Somebody asked over on the Lions Den message board, which you can access along with our other premium content for $1 for 7 days at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Somebody asked this morning if they had missed his intro news conference. You have not.
No.
So Penn State has not put that on the schedule yet. And I don't want to make any promises, but at this point, when you just look at the calendar, it doesn't really feel like, to me, it would make a lot of sense to try and jam it in this week or this weekend when you're about to have the entire month of February wide open with a recruiting dead period. So I think we're probably going to be waiting a little bit on that, T. Frank. Maybe not.
Yeah.
You never know. They could announce something for this weekend soon, but seems more likely to me we hear from him in February. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I was just going to kind of support what I had been thinking in terms of the timeline of things. If you don't have to rush it, Penn State always, how many years ago did they start that kind of February news conference, the 2025 transition where we could talk to redshirt freshmen and they kind of give an offseason update? They're very good about that, of giving us those during down periods like July and June, and then in February, giving us the opportunity to talk to people within the program, as a whole, as the media. So that's kind of what I was thinking is, why assemble everybody twice? And so we're on the same page there for sure.
Yeah, so we'll see. But Jim Knowles will at some point be introduced as Penn State's new defensive coordinator. Yes, it is, Stephen. You are correct about that.
So it's not long, right?
Right. If I had to guess, usually like the second or third week of February is when that meeting occurs, right kind of in the middle of winter workouts. So we'll see. But anyway, at some point, Jim Knowles will be introduced. But he really played up the Pennsylvania part of his story, T. Frank. Really played up the Philadelphia part of his story. And again, said Penn State is where he wants to be. There's a part of you that kind of stops and thinks, well, what else would he say? That it's not where he wants to be. So there's a part of you that stops there for a second.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's played up the PA angle there. I think the tweet when he was hired was something related to a homecoming. When they tweeted out the first meeting clip, it was something to do with his Philadelphia roots. Like, they're playing up the Keystone State angle and the coming back to Pennsylvania angle pretty hard.
So did Andy Kolnicki, right? Like with the whole story about the Penn State helmet. And it's just interesting that obviously you're identifying people that want to be at Penn State if you're James Franklin. And it's not just about the money. You want people that are fits, et cetera, et cetera. It does feel like they play that up, and which is smart. I'm not saying like it's a bad thing, but I was not surprised at all when that was what was clipped, right? Like, there are these overarching things from the program and from the marketing department, like everyone pulling in the same direction, kind of feels like it filters all the way down. And then James Franklin's not in marketing meetings. That's not what I'm trying to say. But there is this idea of wanting to be here, and this being, the place that is a destination for these coaches and players and stuff. It's interesting to watch it all kind of unfold.
Yes, and that was sort of the same message guys gave when Penn State kept its, instead of reassembling its roster, kept its 24 roster together for 25 with a number of guys coming back. That same theme played out throughout the messaging released by the players then as well. So certainly we can see the angle Penn State is going at this offseason. It's about keeping people who are already here at Penn State, and it's about attracting the best talent on the field and in the coach's box to Penn State. So will all that play out? I was reading a quote from the owner of the Yankees this morning talking about the endless, if you're not a baseball fan, the Dodgers are going to end up spending like at least $80 million more than any other team in baseball this year. And they just keep getting the best players on the market, and, they're being described as a super team and so on and so forth. And it's always important to remember that you can get all the offseason wins you want, but a lot still has to go right during the season for everything to come to fruition the way you hoped it would at this time of year next year. So we'll see if that all plays out. But certainly I think, T. Frank, for Penn State, it's safe to say that, again, outside of the completely ludicrous idea that Abdul Carter or Tyler Warren wouldn't leave for the draft. Like, I think the only quote unquote loss you can point to for Penn State this year, and we'll get into some of this, that's the reason why, as we get into our transfer portal talk. But aside from Kobe King deciding not to use another year, I just don't know what more Penn State could have asked for this offseason. Besides, the eye in the pie, or eye in the, big time receiver edition that
Right.
everyone certainly will now blow up the comment section here on the YouTube show about if they haven't already. But outside of that, I just don't know what more Penn State could want from its offseason so far. I really don't.
Yeah, that's really the thing, is everyone wants there to be an assurance about the receiver position, and Penn State went out and they got pieces instead of like that dominant number one. And then linebacker would be the other situation, given they brought some guys on campus. They had some interest early in the portal, and that didn't go their way. I also don't know that the kid from Oklahoma State would have necessarily filled the Mike linebacker position specifically, and so there's a little bit of some just uneasiness on a team that feels like it reloaded for a championship run. And then there are certain positions that need to develop and figure themselves out. And it's just a kind of a bit of an alarm that's going off in the chat, right? Of it's got to be receiver. So I'm just kind of restating what you said, because it is the most obvious thing. If they didn't go out and fix the one thing with an absolute assured, this is going to work sort of player, which even then that doesn't really exist, because anything can happen from injury to, not fitting the way you expect, etc.
Right. So Penn State obviously will continue on with the offseason as it ends the contact period here in January, moves into February. Speaking of moving on, we're going to move into the section of today's show that focuses on what Penn State did in the transfer portal. And we'll start that conversation with the losses. Thank you, T. Frank. You hit the button for me. That Penn State had in the transfer portal. So we all know that before the college football playoff run even started, Jerry Cross left Penn State, ended up at Memphis, former tight end who fought injuries for much of his time in State College, and Bo Prabula, as we all know, seven-figure NIL deal, among many other reasons why he left Penn State before the CFP run and ended up at Missouri, where he is expected to be the starting quarterback in 2025. Other notable names, Tyrese Mills, the former backup defender and special teamer, officially committed to UConn on Tuesday, January 28th. So he is now off the board. One player left uncommitted in Penn State's transfer portal losses class. That's Mekhi Flowers, former safety turned wide receiver. He has yet to pick where he is going to go, so stay tuned for any potential updates on that. But by and large, T. Frank, the loss, as has typically been the case for Penn State in every situation aside from Keandre Lambert-Smith, and you could still even argue that moving to Auburn was a step back to some degree, or a step down for him to some degree,
right.
Maybe sort of, not really, kind of. That was a bit of a different situation too. But for another offseason,
one team made the college football playoffs and were one of the four teams. The other one, were they 9-3? Something like that.
I mean, those lines,
from a football standpoint, there's one thing. From a production, NFL, dollars in NIL standpoint, clearly he made a step up. So it depends on what you value most in these situations, right?
Right. And so for Penn State, I think if you look at this year's movement, it's all guys who are looking for bigger, better opportunities to play and find their way to the field. I mean, when you look at the list of Penn State players who moved on, obviously Bo Prabula played a good amount as the, Wildcat quarterback, or whatever, the Prabula package, whatever you want to call it. But, the receivers, and I guess let's start with them. So 3 receivers move on, and we'll move to the defensive side of the ball. Tyler Johnson to East Carolina, never played at Penn State, except for maybe a snap or two here or there. Trey Wallace goes to Ole Miss and joins Lane Kiffin in the SEC. And Omari Evans stays in the Big Ten, landing at Washington. I believe that was about a week ago at this point in time, something like that. So any thoughts on those 3 receivers? Maybe not so much Johnson, but Wallace and Evans. One stays in the Big Ten, one goes to the SEC. I had some people ask me recently, T. Frank, about this idea that, well, if they were good enough to go to those schools, shouldn't they have been good enough to do more at Penn State? To me, I would just continue to hold the line of thinking that a fresh start was just going to be best for everyone anyway you slice it.
Yeah, and I think from the standpoint of assurances and having more options, because if you can't find one, having 5 sometimes can help. Right. So Trey Wallace leaving, Kyron Hudson and Trey Wallace, I think that's kind of the question of, how would you have made that work? Both guys, you
Right.
kind of peg into that X role position. But of course, Wallace has a diverse skill set. I think he's fast enough and a good enough player to play at a couple of different positions, as is Kyron Hudson. But then, Trey Wallace wants to be the guy, right? He wants to be the number one receiver on a team that's going to throw him the football. And so that makes sense. Just beyond the needing a fresh start if you're Trey Wallace at a place that is going to prioritize you. And Penn State, make no doubt about it, is going to run the football in 2025, no matter who the receivers are. So how do you find a place that all these guys want to make the NFL, right? That's the dream since you were 10. So Amari Evans feels like that's Washington. And he can be a number one receiver, and he can try and assert himself as or maybe even just a guy with an expanded role. At Penn State, it felt like those guys, there was an established understanding of what they were, what they could do, and what they couldn't do, and what they weren't going to be asked to do. So
right.
the new mix of players, do they provide a better result for the team? And these players also feel the same way coming in, that they think this is going to be the opportunity where they can be featured too.
Yeah, and so that brings up a great question in the chat from JC, and it's one I've heard a lot over the last couple of months. Julian Fleming, Dante Cephas, Malik McLean. JC asks, tell me why I shouldn't be skeptical of the two latest transfer commits. Of course, he's talking about the two receivers, Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson, based on the past history Penn State has had bringing in transfers. So you have those three. You also have Mitchell Tinsley as well. Look, it's fair. I can't blame anyone in the fan base or otherwise for looking at this and saying, I refuse to get my hopes up again that Penn State finally found one, let alone two, receivers in the transfer portal who are going to make a bigger impact than the guys who have come in before them did. I just can't blame anybody for being at the point. I think I talked about it last week or maybe a couple weeks ago, or maybe not on here on the BWI Live, so I'm not 100% sure at this point. But when you look at Penn State receiver room outlook, projections, the way people feel about it, however you want to phrase it in 2025, it just feels so much like talking about the offensive line over the last 5 years, like half decade, in terms of, every offseason you'd sit there and say, well, it could be better for X, or it could be better for Y, or it could be better for Z. Mm-hmm. And then you could say, well, X, Y, Z all existed in the same conversation, same tone, same context last year, and it never got better. And now it is finally better for Penn State. So if you're among the group of people that say, I refuse to do anything but seeing is believing when it comes to receiver play and production at Penn State in 2025, whether it's from the transfers, whether it's from the sophomores, whether it's from the incoming freshmen, whatever it may be, returners, like a guy like Liam Clifford, I don't blame him, T. Frank. I can't blame anybody for that at this point in time.
Yeah, no, I'm in the same boat. I think when we talk about the guys that are joining the team, I have concerns for both of those players that this is what happens when you bring in guys that aren't complete receivers from an athletic or from a production standpoint. Is there's questions, and it's on the coaching staff and on the players individually to assimilate into the system and maximize the talent that they have in ways that are meaningful for the team. And that's kind of where I've talked about with the receivers, what their roles can be on this team and how they can help the offense in ways that maybe those other guys couldn't get done. And maybe Andy Kotelnicki, with another year under his belt, understands the talent better, understands the conference better, all these things. Those are the signs of hope, I guess you could say, that are within reason and reasonable, instead of just assuming that Tysier Denmark is going to ascend to the throne and fix all your problems, or that Kyron Hudson is going to do something that we haven't seen him do before at a different program. The one thing I would say about the list of receivers that came up in that conversation, the individual also matters in the conversation. And so I don't know these guys specifically, but the book on Kyron Hudson is that he's going to be a guy that resets the room mentality, which is what they were hoping to get from Julian Fleming. And the difference is Kyron Hudson, from an athletic perspective, has more to offer. And so you're not getting just the guy that has the work ethic, the aggressiveness, the physicality, the mentality that it's my ball and not yours as a receiver. And then, that's a hopeful positive sign. And so at some point, the positional churn and turnover in a lot of those aspects of kind of the subtle things that aren't height, weight, speed, route running ability, etc., Penn State, I think, is working towards that, resetting the mindset of the room as much as resetting the players in the room and their talent level.
Marcus Hagans, Mark Dupuis, the receivers coach and analyst who is the de facto assistant receivers coach, have a lot of work, obviously, cut out for them and their position group entering the 2025 season. T-Frank, we got some more portal stuff to get to, but you want to get to some quick news that just popped up in the last, 90 seconds?
Sure.
Class of 2026, Pennsylvania offensive lineman Tyler Merrill has put out his plan for an announcement. He will pick his school tomorrow on January 30th at 2:20 p.m. Eastern Time on the On3 Recruits YouTube channel. He is coming off a visit to Notre Dame. Fighting Irish, one of 4 teams who were left in the race for him, along with Penn State, Alabama, and you're going to have to give me 1 second to pull this up so I don't get it wrong. One other school left for him. I will get it here in a second. Anyway, at this
I got
point,
you. You keep going.
Yeah, so at this point, Notre Dame is clearly trending for him at this moment in time. There's no doubt about that, coming off of the visit to South Bend. Now he locks in a commitment date. You do not need to be a rocket scientist or a recruiting expert or anything in between those two things to figure out that a guy coming off a visit, setting a commitment date, in more situations than not means he's going to go to the school he just visited. So I bring all this up to note that on Thursday, the BWI Recruiting Show is back with T. Frank, with Ryan Snyder, and with Sean Fitz. They will have the latest info then. You can also go over to Blue White Illustrated for the latest info now, where it's $1 for 7 days of access. But there's some news in the class of 2026. Merrill, of course, a 4-star in the On3 industry rankings. Very good player, T. Frank. I'm sure you have talked about him extensively. So he was down to Wisconsin, Notre Dame, Clemson, Alabama, and Penn State.
The teams you would expect, right? So I was going to fill that in for you. It's just that Clemson being on there is not surprising. Alabama, honestly, being on there is not surprising in terms of the style of play and the players that they've been going after under Kalen DeBoer. He's been at Penn State quite a bit in the offseason, too, going to a lot of camps, being involved in kind of the Penn State camp culture. So it's, as you mentioned, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out which way this win is leaning, given the schedule and the way he's been recruited and all those things. So, if you're a Penn State fan, I wouldn't be optimistic necessarily that he's going to choose Penn State, but there's always time for last minute changes and decisions and all those things. It's interesting that he started out as probably one of the highest priority players, because where he was as a sophomore and as a freshman from a size and development perspective. I do see him more as an interior offensive lineman. At least now I haven't honestly, though, I shouldn't even say that. I haven't watched a lot of his season from last year, but he's got kind of that tweener build and that size. So, Penn State, it's interesting the way that I think Phil Trautwein, maybe we've changed a little bit over the years of what he's looking for a tackle specifically. And On3 has him as an interior offensive lineman, but a guy that I could see he could develop into a tackle, but not somebody who is a for sure locked in tackle prospect. So just generally having Kevin Brown on the 2026 recruiting roster helps if they miss on Tyler Merrill, but you never want to miss on a guy you feel like you've put that much time and investment in when, the chips are down here in the recruiting process.
And he's a top 100 player in the On3 industry rankings who lives about 90 minutes from State College. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But the Fighting Irish certainly trending on the On3 recruiting prediction machine about 30 hours before Tyler Merrill, one of the top players in the class of 2026, makes his college choice. So stay tuned with us for any information on latest developments and so on and so forth there at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. And we'll also have more on that on the recruiting show Thursday with T. Frank and with Ryan Snyder and Sean Fitz. All right, let's get back to our transfer portal conversation. T. Frank, Penn State. The one guy we didn't get to in the addition. Well, so we'll get to we can go back to the losses in a little bit, but the additions. Penn State picks up 2 receivers, as we've discussed ad nauseum on this show, and just about all facets of life. Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross. They get a 2 defensive linemen in Anai White and Owen Wafel. King Mack comes back to Penn State after 1 season away at Alabama. And TJ Shanahan joins Penn State, a guard center who played in 10 games, started 5 at Texas A&M this past season.
Yeah.
So I would say this: when you look at the overall impact additions Penn State made, there's not one that jumps off the table as a guy that is going to, at least on paper, based on everything we know at this moment, going to completely change the 2025 season.
Mm-hmm.
But I do see some guys here that can have an impact in 2025. And I just feel like that's about the ceiling of what Penn State is. Maybe, they're obviously going to always seek the top of the line guys, just like everybody else. But feels to me like if you can get a handful of these guys to make an impact this season, you're doing pretty good. And I think that there's an opportunity for that to be the case with what Penn State's brought in with a group that was officially announced by Penn State last week and is getting ready to embark on winter workouts roughly 3 weeks after getting onto campus.
Greg, you're so responsible. You're so you put these things in such responsible light of these guys could contribute and maybe they won't change. Let's do some speculation, right? Like let's get it. Beverly wants to know which receiver on the roster do you think is most likely to help get Penn State over the hump, i.e. Roman Wilson on the 2023 Michigan championship team. And this is what I mean, Greg, by like you're putting these things into the proper perspective. And like I'll just go ahead and wildly speculate as the dancing jester of the show. I feel like that is my job. Devontae Ross, and this is, the part of the conversation of specifically the Roman Wilson conversation. Speed and athleticism, explosiveness, that explosive passing play that is involved in the RPO and play action game. Can you take a slant and go 60 yards? Or can you take a simple pass, make Drew Aller look great because he throws the ball on the money and suddenly you break an angle or a tackle and you are now creating a chunk play off of speed into space. And that is what the receivers, and it's kind of the point I've been driving at the last couple of years. If you're going to dominate the middle of the field with a Tyler Warren type and a running game, players who are then getting single coverage on the outside need to feast when they get that opportunity. Now, Kyron Hudson has been effective in that role as well in his own way in terms of one-on-one coverage and kind of the jump ball pass. But Ross is the guy coming in at 171 pounds. I think that's a benefit because he was listed much lighter at Troy. And you never really know, right? Like a guy looks the way he looks on film, and he looks small no matter what you think of whether he's 10 pounds heavier or lighter than his listed weight. Yeah. He still, to me, needs to add another 10 pounds to be like, okay, he can absolutely play on this level without question, especially on the outside. And maybe that's a little bit optimistic or a little bit on the high side. Maybe he doesn't need to get all that much bigger, but I do think just generally the question of can he play the Z position, meaning he's outside and threatening the edge of the defense to go deep at any point. And that does at sometimes require you to break contact with a defensive back. You can't just be speed all the time. So I think that's a great development and something that I'm optimistic about given that development with him on the roster to provide that explosive element that is consistently available regardless of the coverage the defense plays. Because that was the biggest problem last year. Penn State didn't have an athletic, explosive option in the passing game that was present in any coverage. And so Ross needs to provide that this year. Among other players, right? It's not just, he's just the one that they brought in specifically to do that.
Right. And Penn State, of course, returns plenty, brings in a number of guys from the high school level. I think ultimately the comment here, I got to find it now. Give me a sec. It was not that long ago, but it's now gone from my screen. Anyway, here it is. Yes, from Rob. Receivers room has transitioned from, basically you knew what you had, what you were working with last season and in the years before that. And now, aside from Liam Clifford, it's almost all new, not just guys coming in from the transfer portal, but also guys who did not play a lot last season at Penn State or in previous seasons at Penn State. So, yeah, at this point, everything is on the developmental hope curve. And if you're a Penn State fan, all you can do is hope for the best and see if that works out. But, yeah, I think you're right on what they brought those guys in to do. Can they do it? We'll have to wait and see. Some of that depends on Drew Aller. Some of that depends on Andy Kotelnicki as much as it does those guys in the receivers room. And then when you look at the rest of this group that Penn State brought in, who's the one guy, if there is one, who interests you the most in terms of having an impact on the 2025 season? I have a pick. I will let you go first, though.
Um, well, there's the obvious one in King Mac. So,
Right.
I'll let. Is that who you were gonna pick?
I was gonna wait to see you picked. I could have made
Okay.
I could have made a couple cases. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just go with King Mac. I think that the way he plays within this defense with Jim Knowles, there's an opportunity for him to make a lot of plays. And so it's interesting that a guy who's 5'10", 195 pounds, let's just call it, is such a downhill player. And that's, I think, the biggest schism in his career so far is that there was a view he might be a slot nickel safety who can play man coverage, that hybrid player. But just so far, the instincts don't seem to be there in man coverage. That could change. Like, I think he's physically capable of doing it. It's just the comfort level, the repetition, and the instincts for being able to play man coverage, which is pretty difficult, especially if you're not a corner who's been doing it your whole career. But in the middle of the field, as a field safety, I think he's got the range and the instincts to break on the ball and make interceptions, and the ability to trigger downhill and be a force in the run game. And that's what Jim Knowles uses those safeties for in this defense, is to plug holes across the formation, because when you only have two linebackers on the field and you're going to play your nickel corner in a certain way, the difference is he will use those safeties almost as like a puzzle piece. Like, when you're filling out the defensive front, you need to fill every single gap. And it's about where are the pieces coming from that are not already in the box. And so you can move linebackers left or right, and you can change the defensive front that way, where suddenly now the safety's coming from an unexpected angle and from an unexpected position. That's safety rotation in a nutshell of what you're trying to do to surprise the offense by putting the extra defender to where the run is going instead of getting it wrong. And I think that Jim Knowles, in the way he operates that defense, he gets it right more times than not, and kind of baits the offense into running into where the safety is going. Mac could be good at that. So I think I would go with him.
Yeah, he is a great pick. At the very least, you would expect him to help out special teams wise for Penn State, but certainly they are not bringing him back, and he is not coming back just to be a all 4-team special teams all-star. He obviously wants to play safety and play it a lot. So we'll see if he can earn those stats beside Wheatley and some of the other Penn State returners. To me, the most fascinating guy, because I just don't want to talk about receivers anymore, is Nittany White. And I think you look at him, the obvious second pick in this conversation. Can he come in, get healthy, and find a role in a Penn State defensive line rotation that is ripe with opportunity? You lose Abdul Carter. You obviously bring back Dennis Sutton. But you just look at the rest of this defensive end room, and it's a little iffy without question, depth-wise. Smith Vilbert also returns for Penn State at defensive end. There's some young guys, Max Granville, of course, being the one that comes immediately to mind. But there's no doubt, for a guy who has played some college football and has shown some ability to be able to do so at a high level, and certainly came as a highly regarded recruit out of high school, there will be every opportunity for him to have an impact on this team in 2025. Will he make the biggest, most positive, splashiest one he can? That's too soon to say, especially when you're not 100% sure of his injury situation coming out of last year. But
can I ask you? Can I ask you about the fact that he was 245 on the Texas A&M roster, and weight numbers mean something and don't mean something at the same time, right? Like, we don't know what exactly the composition of that weight is, but that's a big jump. And so I guess at the very least, it shows you that a Nittany White on a frame that is 6'5", who has been undersized his whole career in terms of the weight to length distribution, he can at least hold 262 pounds on his frame. Whether or not it is good or bad weight, I don't know. But it is interesting that if that is good weight, that is also a part of the conversation of some of the deficiencies he had in his game of being a better, more consistent player. I mean, that would be a huge win for Penn State, but I don't know anything about what happened to get him to that point. And I guess how do you think about that? Because I tend to go optimistic and become excited for the potential, and then that is, entirely speculation.
Yeah. So it's tough for a couple of reasons. One, because you don't know to the point, and we don't have to get way in the weeds here, but to the point of not always being able to trust roster listings on by the college football programs put out there. Sometimes, like when they remove these guys, so if you don't follow it as close as we do, and there's really no good reason to refresh the Go PSU Sports roster page multiple times a day, so let us do that and we'll keep you in the loop. But as soon as a guy goes in the portal and is reported, they remove that guy from the roster. And sometimes his complete latest profile gets wiped. And so the closest one you can find is from the year before. Yeah, I do not think that's the case with Nittany White. I think his listing at 245 on the 2024 Texas A&M roster is where he was at the start of the year. But once he got hurt, obviously they weren't updating that. And so did he put more mass on during that time he was hurt? Was it good weight, bad weight? Did he do something extraordinary, or did they make a tweak when he got to Penn State, or once they knew he was coming to Penn State, started as soon as they could before he arrived, that changed his body, added weight? We just don't know that answer. And so we'll eventually, like we said earlier in the show, get a chance to hear from James Franklin in a transition into to the 2025 season news conference, here from Jim Knowles, some others as well. And so, it goes without saying, one of the big topics will be what is the plan for the receivers that you brought in via the portal, and then what is the plan for Nittany White. Unfortunately, Penn State had its last big sort of media day hurrah when it was at the Fiesta Bowl, which was after the transfer guys had signed, but before a period in time where the position coaches were allowed to talk about them based on the way all the rules and everything work. So those guys were not available at the Orange Bowl. So we still have not heard from anybody within the program in a public setting about what those guys can do, where they're at, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, most of the weights that were listed at previous schools were pretty similar with these guys at Penn State when they were announced. But White certainly is the one that stood out the most, Frank, in terms of a change. And, again, it's just without seeing him, without knowing, it's hard to say what exactly that change was. But certainly a guy to keep an eye on this year. There's, again, no matter if he's growing up to be up in weight, up in size, up in body type, to be a quasi-defensive tackle, somebody that can play maybe both. Certainly there's an opportunity that exists for that role. There's an opportunity that exists for a straight defensive end to make an impact on this rotation this year, and the same thing goes at defensive tackle. So no matter what, whether it works out or not is one thing, but there is certainly absolutely opportunity for Nittany White this year at Penn State.
Yeah, for sure. The only other guy that we've talked about all of them at this point, but I'm a big fan of what TJ Shanahan can be at Penn State. If they did not have as much depth, I think there would be an outside chance he could play this year. But it's not something they have to force, and they don't have to get him in the lineup if he's not one of the 5 or 6 best players on the team. So they bring it he's the guy that when you talk about developmental long-term projection of, getting a guy into the program that has a high upside and can be a long-term high-level starter for you, he's the guy that I peg in that role that I know something about. Owen Wafel could absolutely be that guy. No idea about what he has done at Michigan in his time there.
Right. So he's a guy that certainly is on that developmental track for Penn State now that he is at Penn State. He also has a younger brother who's a recruit in one of the future classes, so something to keep an eye on there. That sounds right, yes. So something to keep an eye on there as well. But by and large, that recaps the transfer portal so far for Penn State. A new window will open in the spring for Penn State and other schools to go out and try and find new talent and or lose players potentially to the transfer portal. So we will see how that all shakes out for Penn State. Quite some time before that comes to fruition. But let's move into the next part of the show. BWI Live, January 29th. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I am Greg Pickel from BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, where it's always $1 for 7 days of access to the latest premium team and recruiting news, plus the Lions Den message board and so much more. Certainly join us over there, BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Strongest positions, T. Frank, for Penn State in 2025. So as we've noted, Penn State has made some changes at various spots and also returned some very key players to its roster that had the chance to go to the NFL draft and or had the chance to move on to anywhere else they could have wanted to via the transfer portal. So a couple different places I think you could open the bidding here. I will let you do so whichever spot you would like. And without question, I think that what's funny is we're going to talk strongest and then weakest position groups. And I think that, you could have, you don't got to be
You could just replay the first 30 minutes of the show and you'll get some of the answers.
Out. But strongest position group, Frank. Give me your leadoff batter.
Offensive line. I don't know if it's the number one strongest, because there's certainly another position on offense that can make that case that it is the strongest position and the deepest. But in terms of the number of players, in my mind, I'm giving it the edge, because Penn State, first off, when have they been 4 deep at offensive tackle where you feel like there are guys who could participate this upcoming season? And then the interior of the offense.
Answer to that question?
Never. Yeah, under James Franklin, for sure, it's never. Right. And so this is unprecedented, uncharted territory. And then you filter that depth and that competition to the interior, and you've got guys that you're trying to find positions for. I think part of the conversation, I'm not trying to cast any sort of bad juju here, but you got a lot of guys that are going to want to play, and there aren't enough reps for everyone to play that has come back this year, or that is a part of the conversation of deserving that based on what we've seen of them over their time. So I think that, plus another year in Andy Kotelnicki's system, and what they already did to end last year, is going to be a major advantage for Penn State. And the way Nolan Rucci played down the stretch last year, I was just so impressed with his development from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, from a technique standpoint and from a overall performance and output, because Anthony Donko was doing his best to play out there with basically half a body that was functioning. One side of a leg and an arm didn't really work all that well.
Right.
That's not good for an offensive lineman. And so if you can eliminate...
Or anyone for that matter, but especially an offensive lineman who starts at tackle in the Big Ten, yes.
Right, and has to use his body to shove other people out of the way. And if you can only shove effectively with one side of your body, that also means you really aren't that good with that side of your body either. It is a full body position. So when he was out there, they did have some issues of you can't really run through the B gap on that side. And so they were trying to run around his injury, which makes you more predictable and also eliminate some of the things you want to do on offense.
Right.
Sure. And the outside zone system, specifically those plays, once Nolan Rucci got in there and got comfortable, you could see, even if he wasn't Anthony Donko, he was able to block on both sides of his body. And it became a system where you got to see what everyone was so excited about with Andy Kotelnicki that we saw at the beginning of the season. So I think they'll be able to have enough fresh, healthy bodies that can contribute next year and have attrition happen too. So I think that's huge.
Nolan Rucci, a guy that is almost, I'm not even sure the right word here. Pathetic is too harsh, but astounding, I think, is the one I'm looking for. That the fact that that guy came in from where he was at this point last year and was able to play at the level he was, and it's not talked about more. It's just one of those crazy college football, washer media cycle, fan talk things where it's like, how in the world is this not something that comes up almost every day? The strides this guy made. I was just listening to you talk and thinking, I know we spent some time on this, but not nearly as much as we do in the negative direction, which is just kind of somehow the way this stuff works. But certainly an impressive year for him from start to finish. Mm-hmm. And Penn State, to your point, now has the depth at across the offensive line it's never had before. By the way, I don't know if you guys saw, Sal Wormley is playing in the East-West Shrine Bowl tomorrow. He was added to the roster earlier this week. That totally flew under my radar. But in this offensive line conversation, it's worth noting because he is the only starter at this point that is not due back to Penn State in 2025. Again, just something that is hard to, I think, put into words, but you've seen it in action over the last few postseasons, how important it is, T. Frank, and how much of a difference it is when you have veteran, older offensive linemen in the trenches, and that's something Penn State will have this year as long as the injury bug does not bite it. It's something it hasn't had before in a lot of cases.
Yeah. What's your strongest position here?
I mean, I think we'll just go right to the running back room, right? I mean,
right.
You returned the best duo in college football at running back in Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Either of them could have elected to go to the NFL draft. Either of them could have elected to hit the transfer portal and be a star somewhere else. Instead, they both come back to Penn State for a unprecedented, what I would say, fourth year at Penn State. One, because you don't see a lot of running backs go the distance that have played the way those two have played. And two, you don't see almost ever two guys at the same position that good decide to stick with each other and the program for 4 years when they could clearly be a star somewhere else. So I think that's the obvious next logical spot after the offensive line. Penn State is good with the top two. It returns Corey Smith. It returns Quentin Martin, who had some fine showings at times last year. Martin early and Smith later in the season. And there's other players on the roster as well. So, yeah, I just think that is a spot where, as you've mentioned before, Penn State is going to clearly try and run its offense through the running game, as it did for much of the 2024 season, and maybe even more so this year without Tyler Warren around. So, yeah, easy second pick for me there. I just think that it is going to be fun after Andy Kolnicki has 7 months or whatever it is to scheme up some new stuff for these guys, what he can come up with, and what ways can he use them, T. Frank, that he used Tyler Warren in so many creative ways before in 2024, featuring his best player in ways that would get the ball in his hands.
Yeah.
What can he dream up for these two guys to do the same thing at a different position? It's fascinating to follow that this offseason.
Wow. Great transition. Let me just hit the graphic. Yeah. What's on the other side? An area that needs to develop for Penn State to be able to reach the levels of success they want to get to. I guess we could take receiver off the table, seeing as we spent all offseason talking about it.
Please. What do you mean? Yeah, we got a lot more receiver talk to come in the rest of the offseason ahead.
So, obvious ones aside, where are we going for places that need a strong offseason to develop some players to contribute at a level that can get them back to where they were this year?
Yeah, I hate I understand why we're going with weakest, but to me, it's more of an idea of concerns, questions. Could be a weakness, no question. And I do have concerns at linebacker at this second in time. I think you look at what Penn State brings back there. It does not, at least at this second, have a true ready-to-go, ready-made Mike, unless you're bulking up Tony Rojas or playing Dom DeLuca a lot more in 2024. But even with knowing those two guys are back, T. Frank, it's just a numbers game to me. And that position group has, I think it was you and I standing at practice one day in Haluba Hall, and we were looking at the linebackers last season at some point. We're just like, there's not a lot of guys going through that line. When the linebackers' turn was for ball security, something or other. And I just remember standing next to you and thinking, man, this is, they could really find themselves in some trouble. And they lose Kobe King, they lose Tyler Elsdon, and I know many of you felt whatever kind of way you felt about Elsdon, but he was useful on special teams and sometimes on defense as well. You lose him, and you have a lot of guys back behind Rojas, behind Dom DeLuca, that have played at times, but are they ready for the big time, the spotlight?
Yeah.
And I don't really know, looking at the roster as it currently sits, T. Frank, not sure how you could feel overly confident about that. I think you can find positives from last season's tape to think that this group is ready to go and take a step forward. I think you can point to Dan Connor being at Penn State still and saying this guy is not going to let the legacy of linebacker you linger despite losing guys. So I think there's some things you can feel good about. But in terms of, this list got to start somewhere, right? It's like ranking your kids or your dogs. Like one of them, you can sit there and say they're all tied for first, but when push comes to shove, there's a ranking of some sort. And so you have to start this list somewhere. To me, it's linebacker is the one that I'm most concerned about. And we'll see. Again, pieces there, certainly, but lots of strides must be taken. And also, you're talking about a position group that it will be learning a new defense under a guy who will ask it, obviously, to do plenty.
That's why I'm going with defensive tackle, because you want the linebackers to have as clean of a look as possible to give them the opportunity from that youth perspective to develop. And so I think Tony Rojas is going to be fine, truthfully.
I do too. And I think that we keep forgetting how much that early season injury issue that seemed to pop up that kind of became an afterthought throughout the season, even though I don't think it was an afterthought to the people in the training and recovery rooms all year.
And it just,
Be very interested to see once he is presumably back to full strength this season, and especially this spring and this summer, what he's able to do. And we'll be able to get a little bit more insight from him and them on that later this year. But yeah, anyway, defensive tackle, I guess I have a thought. I'll let you finish it then, but there's some issues creeping up about this defense.
So with the defensive tackle room, you'd feel really good with your top two of Zane Durant and Alonzo Ford, except Alonzo Ford is injured. So from what I've seen of Jim Knowles' defense, he does prefer to have a 1 and a 3 technique on his roster in terms of that's how we're going to play by alignment. And so who's the one tech if they decide to do that? There's a lot of questions about this is a great hire for Penn State, but with the specific talent, especially in the front seven. That's why, like the last week or so, I've focused mostly on the run game and the box, because to me, that's what sets everything else up. That the stuff on the back end, that's great when you can do it, but if you can't play with light numbers in the box, then it doesn't necessarily matter. So let's take a look at the roster in terms of guys that are going to be a part of the conversation. Ty Blanding, 292 pounds right now on the roster. Size doesn't mean everything. Kind of like the conversation earlier, because the 58 for Ohio State was 295 pounds. He was their 1 technique. So and Tyleik Williams, 327 pounds, was their 3 technique. So it's about how you play and your strengths as a player. But we don't know a lot about some of these guys. Ty Blanding, Xavier Gilliam, Joseph McCoy is a defensive tackle on the roster. Caleb Artis as a ascending redshirt junior. Haven't seen anything from him during his time at Penn State. And then you're looking at DeAndre Cook, a lot of freshmen we're talking about. Not a whole lot of those guys that are in that redshirt freshman, redshirt sophomore area that are ready to ascend. So there's going to be some projection here. And that's where you get a little uncomfortable with a position like defensive tackle and projecting young guys into bigger roles, because that's a big leap, as opposed to some of the other positions where it can be as much mental as it is physical. It's all physical at defensive tackle.
Yeah, and I don't like to be wet blanket guy, and this isn't intending to be. It's just the reality of the conversation we just spent the last 5 minutes having. But for years, Penn State has been able to, almost like a baseball diamond, feel pretty good about being strong up the middle and not going into a season with question marks up the middle of its defense. And it goes into those big time. It goes into this year with those big time. You mentioned Alonzo Ford's injury and how long it'll take him to get back on the field. We just talked about the situation at linebacker. At safety, you return Wheatley, which is awesome. You get King Mack back, great. You had a pretty productive year from Lane, the freshman who's going to be a sophomore this year. Like, there's not a completely empty cupboard, but there are question marks, and I'm not saying that it's going to be one that derails Penn State's season or anything, but certainly there are position groups that are in focus in terms of needing to take a step forward. So you have, obviously, we talked about linebacker, we talked about defensive tackle. Just generally speaking, looking across the rest of this roster, because I know we don't have too much time left and have one more segment to get to, but where do you go from there after the linebacker, defensive tackle? And again, if you're just tuning in, receiver was not allowed to be picked because that's just not fair. So receiver obviously led the list as a question mark position. One thing I'll note before I get to answer that question to you, Frank, Colin says in the chat, I would assume once the new DC gets a feel for new personnel, Penn State will add another piece in the spring portal. Problem is, spring portal is typically not somewhere you're going to find a piece that's going to help you for the next season. Might be a depth addition or something like that, maybe a special teamer, but would not get your hopes up for the spring portal, but we'll wait and see. But anyway, after receiver, linebacker, defensive tackle, the position you have questions the most about next is...
So this is funny. Like, I'm going off book, and it's not necessarily a weakness or a position that needs to develop. I just don't know how they're going to use the safeties yet. So specifically that slot safety, who is going to be the nickel player? Generally, like going back and looking at the body types and the players that have played that position, corners are not out of the question here, right? So even the players at Ohio State, they took a corner who was a bigger corner and made him a safety and played that nickel role. Zion Tracy is not that big. So generally the size is about 195 pounds, about 6'1", across a long enough stretch of time that there is at least a somewhat of a blueprint. But of course, like there's guys that are 5'11", 195 in there, but that size and that physicality. The point I want to make here is that Tracy's tackling was bad last year, and his run defense put in that position was not what they were hoping or expecting to get, because they were thinking that would be Jalen Reed. I think that expectation still maintains. So if you're going in, and I expect them to go in right now with Zion Tracy as the lead guy at the nickel position, he needs to improve, or they need to find a guy with a closer body type, skill set, and ability to fulfill the position mentally, because it's a hard one. Like, to play safety, linebacker, hybrid, and to have to understand underneath coverage and deep coverage and the rotations that go into playing this defense. It's a mental load. So you could say Dejon Lane, and yeah, of course, like that's the guy you want to play at every position, but they clearly want guys that know what they're doing over guys that are athletic enough to do it, because what they did is they played Tracy and Cam Miller instead of playing Lane last year because they wanted somebody they trusted out there. So does Lane accelerate that understanding and that development of not just in the defense, but football overall, in order to ascend and then give them the flexibility to maybe play even Zakee Wheatley in the slot? Like, that could be a possibility. He could play any of the three positions, but who's ready to play in them? And so that's, to me, not necessarily they have the bodies. I think they have the talent. It's just, how does it all fit together? I don't know that one yet. And so that's where it's an area of understanding and development for me.
Plenty of questions to answer about the Penn State defense and offense and many other parts of this program moving forward.
And it's good, by the way.
Yes.
It's still going to be a good defense.
Exactly, yes. Speaking of that, we're coming down the home stretch of this edition of the BWI Live Show, Sunday Film Study. You have been taking some deep dives into Jim Knowles' history as a defensive coordinator. Pretty interesting career arc. If you're not familiar, we will not go through every stop along the way, but played at Cornell, as we noted earlier in the show, a Philadelphia native. Was at Oklahoma State and then came to Penn State, but spent some time at Duke. Then he went to Ohio State and then came to Penn State, but spent some time at Duke in the mid-2010s, where he visited Penn State and James Franklin as a part of an off-season trip. And so there's been familiarity between James Franklin and Jim Knowles for a long time, and obviously Penn State went out and got the top candidate on the, well, I guess he was not on the market until he was. That's how these things
right?
work. But you know what I was getting at.
Yeah.
So we don't have a ton of time here, so I don't know if we want to get too far into the weeds. But just from what you've been watching of Jim Knowles' defenses over the years, if you ran into somebody on the street, Frank, who said, I haven't watched a whole lot of Ohio State, just tell me the top 2-3 things I should know about a Jim Knowles defense. It's going to impact me, the Penn State fan. If you ran into that person, what would you tell them off the jump?
Yeah, so I think there's an even further emphasis on the three safeties, specifically at Ohio State. I know there's a lot of questions by smart people who are going in and they're getting all the information. They're saying, hey, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? From the Oklahoma time where he developed this defense. And so, I'm still working on that in terms of the full picture, but we're looking at what he was hired to do.
For you, buddy. It's a long off season and we have a lot of Wednesday
People
hours to
want the
fill.
answers now, and I feel, because I want the answers now too. It's a little overwhelming to try and absorb all the information so that I can reasonably give you a answer that I'm capable of giving you, not from the nitty gritty of being in the room and understanding how every technique works. But they will not be as aggressive, from what I understand, in terms of trying to get tackles for loss and playing behind the line of scrimmage. I've been trying to do a lot of work on this and understanding how this defense is different from the Manny Diaz style. And I'm just putting Tom Allen in that kind of coaching side, because even before he was at Penn State, he was very aggressive in the way he would blitz and attack. There's not as much blitzing from Jim Knowles. And that's not to say he doesn't do it, but he's just more down the line on everything. So man coverage versus zone splits, more down the line than Tom Allen was. Coverages, less aggressive in sending guys after the quarterback, and also in run blitzing. I think that there's a more controlled, and I wrote about this yesterday, there's more of a controlled element of the run defense, specifically from the box. And this is where I think there's an opportunity for maybe guys to ascend in that particular conversation at linebacker and at defensive tackle, because it might be a different skill set and an emphasis on what they're asked to do. Instead of, you need guys that are athletic enough to get into a gap and then win the gap, as opposed to, we're going to have you in the gap and what you have to do is control it. That might be a little bit of a different skill set from a run defense perspective that might give some guys who didn't have all of the tools in the tool bag the ability to play and play more consistently than they have previously. And it's something we got to figure out, like in terms of asking Jim Knowles and understanding in what they want to do in this iteration of his defense. So that's the main thing from the front. It's going to look and feel very different. And then on the back end, it's about those three safeties from what we saw at Ohio State, where he's going to be playing sometimes a safety as a middle linebacker 8 yards off the ball, where that guy can, and I described it a little bit earlier in the show, of basically you can fly downhill and you can add into the run game in a bunch of different ways. That was something Caleb Downs did very well. And then on third down, he became a roving player who could play a bunch of different positions, or he played the field safety. So he kind of played three different positions within the defense. How do they facsimilate all of that is going to be the interesting part of what happens in spring football and whose talents allow them to mix and match. Because obviously there's one Caleb Downs in America, and there was one KJ Winston who got injured, so we're not really gonna know all of those pieces that are gonna fix everything. That's where I'm interested to see how all of this works, and that would be the biggest difference, I'd say, in this defense from what they saw previously.
A lot of work will be done on Penn State meshing what it's done best under James Franklin defensively and what Jim Knowles has always done and run over the course of the month of February, because there is a recruiting dead period leading into spring practice, and that means there will be a lot of time spent in the office doing film studies like the one T. Frank does every Sunday. T. Frank will get into a lot more of that in the weeks ahead. But any final thoughts as we close down the show here, the final Wednesday BWI Live of January?
Yeah, the next thing I'm going to do is go and watch some of that 2021 film from Oklahoma State and see kind of the final iteration and where it was before he moved to Ohio State, and then what concepts and ideas might return and what might have been iterated out. Like things evolve over time. You're not trying to solve the same problem in 2021 Big 12 football that you are in 2025 Big 10 football. So understanding maybe something he wanted to do previously, and maybe that is not what he's going to be doing. I don't know. So we're going to just get all the information, and that's where I'm going to be going into next on that particular side of things. But we got a lot of stuff. We got a lot of stuff coming up here on the YouTube show. We've got a premium podcast coming up this week. In the Lions Den is going to be coming up, and of course our wrestling show. Greg and I are going to we're going to do a quick seat switch, and then we're going to bring you a wrestling show tonight. So all that stuff coming up in the next couple of hours. So there's just a lot to do, despite the fact that it's January 29th. So much Penn State football stuff for you.
Yes, the show rolls on. This one comes to a close, but be back with you on Thursday. Ryan Snyder, Sean Fitz, and of course T. Frank will be here with you on the BWI Live Show. That'll be the recruiting show, the final live, we assume, of January. We will have wrestling coverage, basketball coverage, recruiting, football, transfer portal, and much more at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. It's $1 for 7 days. Check us out there. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button here. And if you're listening to the podcast version, leave us a review. We always appreciate those. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I am Greg Pickel. We will talk to you next time on BWI Live.